On June 13, 2024, a story began moving through American news sites with a headline that sounded more like late-night radio than academic research. Scientists connected to Harvard, readers were told, were considering whether non-human beings might already be here, living underground, hiding beneath the oceans, watching from the far side of the moon, or passing through ordinary society without being recognized. The paper was real, and so were the authors. Tim Lomas and Brendan Case worked at Harvard's Human Flourishing program, while Michael Masters taught biological anthropology at Montana Technological University. Their paper discussed hidden civilizations, unknown terrestrial species, future humans, lunar refuges, and beings that sounded less like visitors from another planet than figures pulled from folklore, which was more than enough for the story to spread. What moved more slowly was the warning attached to it. The authors described the paper as a speculative thought piece, stated that it was not a project of Harvard's Human Flourishing program, and wrote that the hypothesis was, in all likelihood, false. Even their own rough estimate gave some version of it, only about a 10% chance of containing truth. Within days, television segments were asking whether aliens could be walking among us. Although no body had been produced, no machine had been recovered, no underground city had been discovered, and no structure on the moon had been confirmed as artificial. What existed was a question, and the question had already become larger than the paper that asked it. The stranger part was that the idea had not begun at Harvard at all. Nearly 20 years earlier, a writer named Mac Tonnies had been wrestling with a problem that had bothered UFO researchers for decades. If unusual objects really were operating around Earth, why assume they had crossed interstellar space to get here? Why not begin much closer, with the possibility that the source was already here? That question would eventually become the Cryptoterrestrial Hypothesis. Once Tonnies followed that possibility, the problem changed completely, because something native to Earth would not need to arrive. It only needed somewhere to hide. If you enjoy investigations like this, like the video, subscribe, and support the channel, because apparently, even the algorithm enjoys unanswered questions. Tonnies had not invented the broader idea that strange beings might come from Earth rather than space, but he helped give this version a name and a shape. In April 2006, he corrected the record, after realizing that a commenter using the name Mr. X had suggested Cryptoterrestrial first. Tonnies publicly acknowledged it, and kept working on the idea. Instead of imagining visitors crossing light years, he considered something much closer and, in some ways, more uncomfortable. What if at least some beings described in UFO reports belonged to a hidden population that had developed here, adapted to us, and learned to remain largely out of sight? Human-like bodies and repeated appearances near inhabited areas would no longer require travelers studying an alien world. The supposed visitors would already know the place. Tonnies died in 2009, before his ideas appeared in book form. The Cryptoterrestrials was published the following year, and the idea remained mostly within UFO culture, until the 2024 paper carried it into a very different setting. The attraction is easy enough to understand. If even a small number of genuinely unusual UAP reports describe physical objects, placing their origin somewhere nearby, removes the need to explain how they crossed interstellar space. It does not tell us what those objects are, but it does explain why some researchers keep looking for alternatives to visitors arriving from another star. Cases such as the 2004 Nimitz encounter show why that search continues. Navy personnel reported an unusual encounter, and years later, the Defense Department officially released the associated Navy video, while still describing the phenomenon in the footage as unidentified. Nothing about the incident proves Cryptoterrestrials, and it does not establish where the object came from. It does show how a real military observation can remain unresolved long enough for much larger explanations to gather around it. Once the proposed source moves from the stars to Earth, the mystery becomes physical. Something already here needs somewhere to exist. One possibility is that the occupants are human, or descended from humans, and survived from a forgotten civilization that reached technological sophistication before recorded history. Archaeology has repeatedly shown that ancient societies could be older and more complex than previous generations assumed, although scale quickly becomes the problem. Discovering an unexpectedly sophisticated settlement is one thing. Finding an industrial civilization capable of producing machines beyond modern aerospace technology would be something else entirely. A society like that would need mines, energy, manufacturing, transport, maintenance, waste disposal, and a population able to support the system behind those machines. Cities can be buried and coastlines can drown, but industry tends to leave broader traces. Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank approached a related question from a much more cautious direction in 2018. Their Silurian hypothesis did not claim that an earlier industrial civilization existed. Instead, they asked what geological signatures such a civilization might leave, if one had existed millions of years ago, and whether those fingerprints could still be recognized. That question quietly changes the direction of the mystery. It is no longer enough to ask where an advanced society could hide. Eventually, you have to ask what a society capable of building extraordinary machines would fail to hide. The inhabitants would not necessarily have to be human. The authors also raised the possibility of a technologically advanced terrestrial species, perhaps an unknown hominid lineage, or much more speculatively, descendants of an intelligent theropod line. No accepted fossil, genetic, or archaeological evidence shows that such a civilization existed, but once that possibility is raised, one refuge becomes almost impossible to ignore. More than 70% of Earth is covered by ocean, and as of April 2026, only 28% of the global seafloor had been mapped with modern high-resolution multi-beam sonar. That number sounds enormous, because it is, but the missing detail matters. Not mapped in high resolution is not the same thing as completely unknown, since satellite measurements already provide a coarse map of the entire seafloor. The water becomes more interesting when UAP stories enter the picture. Accounts of objects supposedly entering or leaving the ocean have circulated for years, yet the official record is far less dramatic than the folklore around them. The Pentagon's fiscal year 2024 report covered 757 UAP reports and classified none in that dataset as maritime or transmedium, while the previous annual report recorded 1 maritime case and no transmedium cases. That does not prove every strange report near water has an ordinary explanation. It does mean the official data do not resemble a catalog of confirmed machines repeatedly moving between air and ocean. The ocean gives the hypothesis enormous room, in which something could remain difficult to observe, but room alone is not evidence that an underwater civilization is actually there. Going underground seems more practical, because humans have already built mines, shelters, tunnels, military facilities, and subterranean settlements. Living below the surface is real. Keeping an advanced population hidden is harder, because power must come from somewhere, materials have to be moved, machines have to be built and repaired, and a population has to be supplied. If the same hidden society produces craft with the extraordinary performance sometimes attributed to UAP, then the workshops, energy sources, logistics, and physical consequences behind those machines become part of the claim, whether anyone mentions them or not. That is where the investigation starts to change. Asking where the inhabitants could hide is no longer enough, because if a technological civilization really exists somewhere out of sight, then everything required to keep that civilization functioning has to remain out of sight with it. A chamber can disappear beneath a mountain more easily than an industrial ecosystem. Every proposed refuge, therefore, has to conceal not only inhabitants, but resource extraction, construction, energy production, transport, maintenance, and the traces those processes normally leave behind. The moon offers another possibility, while keeping the source close enough to avoid interstellar travel. Its far side is especially attractive, because it never faces Earth, a fact that has probably done more for lunar conspiracy stories than any actual photograph. Yet the far side is not unseen. The Soviet Luna 3 mission photographed it in 1959, and Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has returned extensive high-resolution imagery and topographic data since 2009. It is hidden from someone standing in a backyard on Earth, not from spacecraft orbiting the moon. Scientists have proposed searching lunar imagery for possible extraterrestrial artifacts, because the surface can preserve material for immense periods. The value of that idea is that it can be tested against images and geology. So far, no confirmed nonhuman installation has emerged from that work. At some point, every physical hiding place runs into the same difficulty. The closer we look, the less useful that place becomes as an explanation, unless something physical eventually appears. Of course, none of this requires the inhabitants to have originated here in the first place. The authors also entertain beings that arrived long ago and established a permanent presence. along with what they call extraterrestrials, including the possibility that some apparent visitors could be human descendants associated with another time rather than another planet. Changing the origin makes the story stranger, but it does not remove the present-day problem. Anything living here now still needs some way to exist here now. The most irresistible version avoids remote refuges almost entirely. Perhaps some of the inhabitants can simply move through ordinary society without attracting attention. The article discusses claims involving human-looking non-human intelligence, beings that could supposedly pass as ordinary people. That neatly solves the visibility problem, but creates another one, because what observation could actually separate one from an ordinary human being? No verified individual has been produced, whose genetics, anatomy, physiology, or other measurable characteristics demonstrate membership in a hidden non-human population, and no independently tested person has transformed walking among us from testimony into physical evidence. If a being looks human, behaves human, produces no measurable biological difference, and leaves no technology behind, almost any claim can survive, by saying the evidence remained concealed. The theory solves its visibility problem by creating an evidence problem. From there, the idea moves into much stranger territory. The authors use the phrase magical cryptoterrestrials for entities compared with fairies, elves, nymphs, or earthbound angelic beings, whose reported behavior would appear less technological and more like folklore. A buried city can be searched for, and a hidden animal can leave DNA or a body, but once a proposed being can pass unnoticed as human, or resist ordinary physical testing, the absence of evidence becomes increasingly difficult to interpret. Part of the appeal is easy to understand. The idea pulls the unknown closer. Something beneath the ocean, under a mountain, or moving through our cities, feels more reachable than something from another star, even though that feeling does not make the hypothesis more likely. By the time television segments were asking whether aliens were walking among us, much of that caution had disappeared. Headlines compressed possibilities into something that sounded close to a conclusion. Michael Masters later described the ideas publicly as possibilities worth considering rather than discoveries, while the authors had already warned that the article was speculative and likely false. Their roughly 10% estimate was subjective, not statistical. Eventually, the discussion has to come back to the observations that made these explanations interesting in the first place. Independent UAP study did not find conclusive peer-reviewed evidence that UAP have an extraterrestrial origin, and it emphasized that many reports do not contain enough reliable, calibrated data to establish what was observed. Agencies has likewise said, it has found no evidence that official investigations confirmed extraterrestrial beings' activity or technology. Many reports resolve into balloons, birds, drones, satellites, aircraft, or other ordinary things, while others remain unresolved, because investigators do not have enough information to determine what they were. Unresolved describes the state of the evidence, rather than the identity of the object. So a case does not become extraterrestrial when one explanation fails, and it does not become cryptoterrestrial simply because another theory can accommodate it. That is probably the hardest part of this entire subject, because uncertainty is uncomfortable. An unidentified object feels like a question waiting for an answer, and the temptation is to choose the explanation that makes the question feel complete. Sometimes, the surviving evidence simply does not allow that. The cryptoterrestrial hypothesis remains attractive, because it solves the distance problem elegantly, yet a civilization is more than the moment somebody sees an object. Machines require systems behind them, populations require somewhere to live, and advanced technology requires materials, energy, maintenance, and physical consequences. Oceans provide space without providing cities, tunnels can exist without proving another civilization occupies them, and decades of lunar observation have not revealed a confirmed non-human base. Speculative ideas still have value when they force us to ask better questions. A hidden civilization should require infrastructure and leave traces, and if every missing trace is answered by saying its inhabitants are simply very good at hiding, the hypothesis becomes harder to test rather than stronger. Mac Tonnies never saw the transformation that followed. He died in 2009, before his book was published, and 15 years before an idea he had helped develop reached headlines carrying Harvard's name. What he treated as a speculative alternative to the extraterrestrial hypothesis had become, for a few days in 2024, something millions of people could easily mistake for an academic announcement that hidden beings might already be among them. By then, a question had become an answer. The headlines that began this story were not reporting the discovery of an underwater city, a buried industrial society, a lunar installation, or a non-human person passing through ordinary life. They were reporting a paper whose authors explored an unlikely possibility and explicitly warned that they believed it was probably false. Some UAP cases remain unresolved, and parts of our planet remain poorly explored in detail. Both statements are true. The problem begins when the space between those facts is filled with a civilization, before the evidence gets there. Tonnies' original question still has value, because it challenges an assumption that often enters UFO discussions unnoticed. If something unexplained appears near Earth, there is no logical requirement that its origin must lie among the stars, but moving the answer closer does not remove the need to demonstrate that the answer exists. If something has been here all along, eventually it has to leave more than a possibility. It has to leave evidence that separates a hidden civilization from an unidentified object, an incomplete observation, an unusual animal, a conventional aircraft, or a story that grew while being retold. For now, cryptoterrestrials remain where the investigation places them, inside a hypothesis. The unanswered cases remain unanswered, the unexplored places remain worth exploring, and neither fact gives us permission to quietly turn, we do not know, into they were here all along.